let's get this out of the way up top. I say Bogles. I say it that way because that's how I learned to say it. It's also adorable. I know the technically correct way to pronounce the word is Bogles. Say it however you like. You do you. You can also call this deck green-white hexproof if you hate fun. How to say Bogle isn't the only controversial thing about this deck. I know there are a lot of good reasons to hate the Bogles deck, but there are also a lot of good reasons to love it. I'm in the love it camp personally and have been ever since I set my eyes on my first Slippery Bogle. Why? This deck is fantastic for beginners or anyone who wants to get into Modern but is scared because the format is huge, the decks are expensive, or they're worried they won't be able to compete against people who have been playing the format for years. Bogles is the ultimate I want to try out Modern deck and is a great choice for your first tournament. It's easy to learn, it's a ton of fun to play, and it doesn't require that you understand what your opponent is up to with their deck, which is really the key. The main reason people don't like the deck is because it's what we call not interactive. That means the deck is able to do its thing regardless of what the opponent is playing. It can also be pretty tough to beat before sideboarding, especially if you draw a good opening hand. Yes! So if you're in the I hate Bogles camp, I get it, but you still need to know how to play against it because it will be out there. It is a deck to be taken seriously. In fact, it's been taken to the World Championships by Reed Duke and played by big names like Ari Lax and Seth Manfield, and is usually a legitimate Tier 2 strategy in a Modern tournament. So what I'm saying is, love it or hate it, this deck tech is for everyone. So let's get started. This deck's objective is to build a giant hexproof monster and smash face. Pretty straightforward and pretty fun. It is an aggressive deck, but it runs a bit more like a combo deck because it needs all of its pieces to work its best. The idea is to play out your hexproof 1-drops, slap some auras on them that grow their power and toughness, and beat down, usually gaining a lot of life in the process. Your opening hand is critically important in this deck. Ideally, you'd like a creature and some auras. If you can't get that, you'd at least like to have a creature, as the auras will be easier to draw since there's more of them in the deck. Mulliganing is common with this deck as you dig to find your dudes, so get ready to shuffle that 60. Let's take a look at your creatures. Rather obviously, this deck runs 4 copies of Slippery Bogle. That's where it gets its name. It's the heart of the deck, right alongside your other 1-drop, Gladecover Scout. Both are 1/1s for 1, but they have a very special keyword ability, hexproof. Why is that so important? It's because the whole point of the deck is to play a Bogle or a Scout on turn 1, load it up with a bunch of auras, and swing for huge amounts of damage. Your opponent usually can't do much about it because your creatures have hexproof, meaning they can't be the target of spells or abilities from your opponent. Anything your opponent attempts to play on your creatures that says target creature might as well say target opponent gets wrecked. Some decks run a 1-of Silhana Ledgewalker, some keep one in the sideboard. Where you put it, or don't, is up to you. It can only be blocked by creatures with flying, which is great, and it also has hexproof. The only downside is that it costs 2 instead of 1, and this deck's goal is to kill, and kill fast. The other creature you run either 3 or 4 of is Kor Spiritdancer. While she doesn't have hexproof, she slots in quite nicely in this deck because she draws you a card every time you cast an aura, which is kind of what you're all about. She can also get pretty big pretty quickly, given that she gets +2/+2 for each aura attached to her. The last creature you run is a bit of a weird one. This deck runs a 1-of Dryad Arbor. It's a forest and it taps for green mana just like a normal land. However, it can't tap for green on the turn it enters the battlefield because it is also a 1/1 creature, meaning it is affected by summoning sickness. So why the heck would you want a land that is also a creature? I'll tell you why! Because lots of decks in Modern run what are called edict effects, cards that make you sacrifice a creature, like Leyline of the Veil's -2 ability, for instance. Since the sacrifice effect targets you and not your creatures, hexproof does you no good. Thankfully, if someone tries to edict you, all you have to do is crack one of your fetch lands, search out your Dryad Arbor, which counts since it's technically a forest, and then sacrifice it to the edict effect. A handy little trick. You can also suit up your Arbor with auras if you find yourself in a really rough spot, but that is far from ideal. Now for the most important part of this deck, the enchantment auras. Different versions of this deck run different amounts of these, and some tweak which auras they run, so I'll just let you know what people run generally. Feel free to experiment to find the combination that works best for you or the current metagame. Let's start with the Umbras. These are strange little enchantments with a neat little keyword ability called Totem Armor. That means if someone tries to kill your creature enchanted with one of these auras, the aura gets destroyed instead of the creature. This is particularly helpful for your Kor Spiritdancer who doesn't have hexproof on her own. It's also great against sweepers like Anger of the Gods, Wrath of God, or Supreme Verdict, which doesn't target anything, so your hexproof is irrelevant. One of my favorite enchantments in this deck has to be Rancor. It's great because it gives +2/+0 and grants trample, which is fantastic if your opponent has blockers. It's also great because if your opponent manages to kill your creature wearing a Rancor, the Rancor doesn't go to your graveyard, it goes right back to your hand. Boom, immortality. This deck is not only powerful because it can deal a lot of damage very quickly, it can also gain a metric ton of life. The best way to do this is by casting Daybreak Coronet, aka Jesus, aka Cat with a Scarf. This card is insanely powerful, granting +3/+3 first strike, vigilance, and lifelink. What more could you want in life? The drawbacks are that it can only be attached to a creature that already has an aura attached to it, and it is vulnerable to removal. Keep in mind, if your creature is only wearing 2 auras, and one of them is Daybreak Coronet, it will fall off if the other aura is removed. In spite of that, this is easily the best aura in your deck. You can also gain life with Unflinching Courage. It's a powerful little card that grants +2/+2 and trample, which is pretty big game. Here's a look at the final auras this deck runs. First up is Ethereal Armor. This card is kind of insane in this deck because it grants +1/+1 for each enchantment you control, plus a nice bonus of First Strike. Some builds of this deck also run 1 Glaring Aegis, which gives +1/+3 and taps an opponent's creature when it comes into play, clearing a bit of a path. Some builds run Spirit Mantle, some keep it in the sideboard. It's handy because it provides protection from creatures, meaning your creature wearing it is basically unblockable. And believe me, unblockable is a hot look this season. I also run a Spirit Link, which grants lifelink. A more recent addition to this deck is Gryff's Boon. It's great because it acts similarly to Rancor, jumping back to your hand when you need it, even though you do have to pay. It also grants flying, which can be relevant. This deck doesn't run much of anything outside of a few creatures and enchantments. Older builds of this deck didn't run any spells, but today most people add in 4 Path to Exile. Path to Exile helps get rid of nasty infect creatures, or elves, or Tarmogoyfs, or Thing in the Ice, or really anything from creature decks that rely on a few key players to get their job done. The lands in this deck are pretty straightforward and will be where your money is spent if you want to invest in this deck. The good news is lands usually retain their value pretty well and slot easily into other modern decks. These differ from deck to deck, but I run Forest, Plains, Razorverge Thicket, Horizon Canopy, which lets you sack it to draw a card if you're in need, Misty Rainforest, you could run a Wooded Foothills instead, it makes literally no difference, Temple Garden, and Windswept Heath. As you may know, sideboarding in Modern is extremely important. Lots of matches are won or lost depending on how well you sideboard. It's also highly dependent on the current metagame, so be sure to do your research and be flexible with what you bring in your board. Bearing that in mind, I'll just give you a general overview of what you may want to consider to put in your sideboard. Your #1 sideboard enemy is this little a-hole, Spellskite. The reason it's horrible for you is because your opponent can pay to steal auras and put them on Spellskite, leaving you with an underwhelming army of 1/1s. Nearly 100% of modern decks have at least 1 Spellskite in the sideboard, so keep your eyes out for this card because it will try to ruin your life. Thankfully, you do have some tools in your sideboard to deal with this nightmare. One sideboard possibility is something like Nature's Claim or Natural State. Both are 1 mana and both destroy Spellskite or potentially some other artifact easily. One gains your opponent 4 life but deals with anything, and one deals with artifacts with CMC 3 or less but doesn't allow them to gain life, which can be vitally important if you find yourself in a race. Another card you can consider for these same slots is Seal of Primordium. The bonus here is that it's enchantment for your Ethereal Armor or Kor Spiritdancer to care about. Keep in mind that all of these are also fine sideboard cards against Tron or Affinity. Another way we can deal with our nemesis Spellskite is Stony Silence. It's an enchantment that says activated abilities of artifacts can't be activated, essentially turning Spellskite into a boring old O4. Womp womp. Not to mention that it's a huge pain for Affinity to deal with. Suppression Field is another fantastic sideboard card against the Skite. It also really gets decks like Lantern Control or Abs and Company, as it just makes things really expensive for them, like cracking fetch lands or activating planeswalkers, while you are busy beating down. Let's look at some other sideboard cards that deal with different kinds of threats. Leyline of Sanctity is great against burn decks that are trying to shoot you in the face with a bunch of damage. They can't really bring the pain if they can't target you with their lightning bolts. Bonus, if this card is in your opening hand, you get to play it for free. Special second bonus, it protects your hand from discard or from edict effects, once it's in play. Kor Firewalker is another option to shut off burn, but not every build of the deck runs these. Gaddock Teague is a good sideboard card against any spells with X in their casting cost. Think of things like Wraths or Cryptic Command. Rest in Peace, Relic of Progenitus, and Grafdigger's Cage are all great against Dredge, Tarmogoyf decks, or anything that cares about the graveyard. When you take away those decks' ability to have a graveyard, let's just say they're not very impressive. Melira, Sylvok, Outcast is an all-star against Infect. Some decks add in another Dryad Arbor in the board to help if they're up against it when it comes to edict effects from their opponent. Finally, don't forget about potential sideboard cards like Spirit Link that I mentioned earlier in the video. It's worth mentioning that a large amount of traditional hate cards don't do much about Bogles. This deck isn't vulnerable to graveyard hate or artifact hate, which are some of the most prevalent sideboard cards. This means you can focus on the relatively small amount of cards that do matter to you. Awesome, right? And there you have it, my deck test for Modern Bogles. If you're looking for a deck that's an easy gateway into the Modern format, I suggest you give it a try. It's what I played at my first Modern GP, and it was fantastic. If you do run it, remember to survey the metagame for your sideboard. And good luck, high five.